Ron, it's a great privilege for us to meet up. It's been many years, I think, since we've seen each other in person. Thank you very much for coming through and being willing to share in this little conversation.
My privilege.
You know, we share a common, both of us born in South Africa, but in many ways one could think of it as reflecting different sides of the same South Africa. And maybe we have to share with our audience some of the more painful things. At your birth, you got a birth certificate.
Correct.
And there was one little word that was stamped on that birth certificate that structured the rest of your experience in South Africa. How did that work?
In my case, actually, there was a little more definition. They used the word Cape, meaning where I was located.
That's correct.
Cape colored.
Yes.
And of course, in the South African context, that really meant kind of the in-between people, between white or European, as it was called back then, and non-white or non-European, which is the broad category. And within the broad category, there was colored and, of course, Asian, and then African black.
Right. And often divided into tribal backgrounds as well.
Very complex system, but I was, quote-unquote, part of the colored group.
That's right. Yeah. Now, I don't know that we ever shared classes together at Hildebrand College, because I think you came for 1 year after Good Hope College.
Correct.
The year after I graduated. But I do think you shared classes, or you at the same time as my sisters and Cheryl, my wife.
Correct. In fact, we graduated together in 1974.
That's it. Right. Now, did you end up graduating from Hildebrand, or did they, in a sense, make you graduate from Good Hope College, even though you spent your final year there?
Well, no, we were, myself and two friends, Daniel Doman and Calvin Pleikes, were the first three students of color, to use contemporary language, officially accepted into Heidelberg, because Good Hope had a 3-year degree, and they accepted us to finish our 4th year, and so we were permitted to march and to actually graduate at Heidelberg, 1974.
Wow. And we'll come back to that. So I like to talk a little bit about your experience, because, here's our Adventist school, sister institution to La Sierra. And those were the heights of apartheid era and your own experience. Of course, we're living in a time now with such horrendous things going on. Gross violations of human rights, people being killed left, right, and center. But I think it may be helpful just to show that racism, apartheid affected not only the big things, life and death matters, but also a matter of one's dignity, one's sense of self, one's, the violation of one's identity. Maybe you can just tell us a story from your high school days when you were singing at even our Adventist school, and how you felt about singing the national anthem, for example.
Yeah, when you grow up as a kid, though, let's say elementary school or what we call primary school back home, you don't notice certain things. But once you get into high school, obviously, you become more conscious, more aware. And I recall when I was in high school, we would stand and sing the national anthem. And by the time I was towards the end of finishing my 12th grade, I personally began to struggle with that, because I knew by that time that I couldn't vote.
Yeah,
I had no say really in the government, even though I may have been old enough, but because I was one of those, let's put it gently, marginalized,
that's right,
that I couldn't vote. And so I could not sing the national anthem anymore, because this was a foreign, even though it was my country. To me, it did not represent part of what I could do. How could I sing an anthem that did not represent fairness and equality and justice? It was a real challenge, and that was perhaps the beginning of an awareness that there were issues that separated me, and we were of a different status, maybe a different caste.
Then later on, I think it was after high school, you actually applied for a job. That was a horrendous experience. We had a chance to catch up on the phone, and I'd love you to share that horrific experience.
Oh, you're right. That was the most unusual one. I didn't expect it. The Lord had blessed, by the way, when I finished high school. I had done reasonably well, and my grades were good. I thank God for that. And I saw a job advertised back then, like what in the newspaper, job ads, and
Right.
I followed through and went out. I think it was by bus to get to the place, and I didn't have a vehicle, as I recall, and went through the interview process. Long story short, they came out and they said, "The job is yours. We would like to employ you." And I was excited, obviously, at this prospect. And they said, "Now the only thing we need to is make copies of your what was called then junior certificate, which is grade 10 certificate,
Right.
and then your 12th grade certificate, matriculation, we call that." And I handed those in, and I went to photocopy them. And I was sitting waiting for them to come back, of course, tell me which day I would begin. And suddenly the gentleman who was copying it came back with a different look on his face, and he said, "Mr. Dupree, I am so very, very sorry." I looked at him. I had just passed the interview. They just offered me the job. Said, we cannot employ you." And I looked at him, and he said, "This job is for whites only." Now, what had happened, brief story, is that the year before, the politics had caused a change in who granted the certificates. When my sister graduated, her final high school diploma simply said Department of Education. By the
Right.
time I came along, 2-3 years later, it says Department of Colored Affairs.
Yeah.
And of course, when he photocopied it, he suddenly realized I was not white. And I remember to this day how embarrassed he seemed and apologetic, which I was appreciative of for his kindness. However, it stung. It hurt.
I'm sure it did. I mean, for people to understand that in South Africa at the time, there was not only the Group Areas Act, you could only live and operate in certain places. We'll come back to that one. But job reservation.
Absolutely.
So that, certain jobs were reserved according to that little mark on your birth certificate.
And almost always the better paying jobs.
Of course, that's right.
So there was a financial.
This wasn't just division, separate but equal. This was clearly discriminatory.
Correct.
And made a huge difference. So Ron, I want to just touch on another time, a bit more serious, when you went into Cape Town to look for postcards and ended up and I won't jump to the end of the story.
Right. Sometimes things happen unexpectedly. I want to go back, just track back for 1 minute or two on this job issue, because there was a time also I was hunting for a job and talking about separate but unequal, and I needed to get to this job interview. Another brief story, and the only buses going in that direction were buses that were whites only. And I was in Johannesburg at this point in time, not Cape Town, as the previous story was. And I got on the bus because there was no other transportation. Didn't have a bicycle, didn't have a car, anything. And I was on the bus on the way to the appointment, trying to get this job. And the bus conductor, person in charge, came along and turned to me and he saw who I was. He recognized and basically kicked me off the bus. As I recall, they didn't even stop the bus. I think they slowed down. But I had to get out of that bus.
Wow.
So I didn't get to that appointment.
Wow.
And I just, wow. Well, this is the reality of life. Thankfully, I didn't fall or get hurt. But now going to the story in Cape Town, shortly before I moved to the United States, really simply to come and study at Andrews University back in the 70s, I didn't even own a camera. Obviously, we were not wealthy. And again, I mentioned, jobs were reserved for whites and the better paying jobs. So those who were not in the better class got less pay and were economically depressed as well. So I didn't even own a camera. I thought, if I'm coming to the USA, to Andrews to study, and fortunately, my uncle was already there, and he said, come and stay with me, so that helped to reduce the costs. He also raised some money for me to study. And so I said, let me go to Cape Town, my favorite city where I was raised, born in that area, and I want to get some postcards as a memory. Friends of mine said, Ron, be careful. There's, at least on the radio, there's been news about some protests in the city. I said, but I got to get postcards. The only place I can get it is in the city. So I went to Cape Town by train, And when I got into one of the main streets, many who are from that area will remember Adderley Street.
Right.
And I remember looking up the road towards the gardens, and I noticed a huge group of, obviously, university students and others come down the road. And I realized, oh, my friends were right. This is not the place to be. So I thought, but I got to find my postcards. I'm leaving. I'm going to the United States to study for at least a year. That was my plan back then.
Your choices have been postcards and protest.
Yes. Now, I wasn't part of the protest, but I was in, probably 20 or so, 24, 25. I'd finished college at Heidelberg, and I was dressed with just a regular shirt or T-shirt and a blue jeans. So I approached one of the policemen nearby, and I said, "Excuse me, sir, where can I find postcards?" He looked at me, and instead of answering my question, he turned on me and he said, "What are you doing here?" speaking in Afrikaans, and he started chasing me. And I darted and I ran as fast as I could. Fortunately, I was young, fit, and I got away quickly. But I hadn't gotten my postcards. Now, I was still young and I guess a little bit foolish, and I decided I've got to find the cards. So I found a circuitous route to get back and to look for cards. Somehow, the same policeman sees me a second time. And he sees me and he turns on me, catches me unexpectedly. And he says, "What are you still doing here?" And he pulled out his baton and he gets him across the back. And I ran and I thought, oh, he's got a gun. What if he shoots, And of course, one of my friends from high school had actually been killed by a stray bullet.
Oh, my.
He was 2 or 3 classes below, but I knew him well. I knew his sister. He got shot and killed, apparently accidentally, but he got killed. And of course, I'm running now, and I managed to get away again. But again, perhaps foolishly, I said, I've got to get my postcards. So I eventually quietly looked around, and eventually I got to the CNA, Central News Agency, bought my postcards, and then hightailed it back home as fast as I could and took my shirt off, and I showed my friends my marks of what I had suffered to get those postcards. But thank God I survived. But whether it be political challenge, physical challenge, even just to get some postcards. I was not in the wrong place at the wrong time. I had approached him to make sure he knew I wasn't part of the protest. I was hundreds of meters or yards away, but he turned on me. I was not of the right hue, of the right color, I'm sure.
Wow. Ron, when these things happen in the political sphere and in the public sphere, it's one thing. But I think there's an additional layer of hurt when things are not done in the optimal, in the right way, in the way of dignity and fairness, even in our own schools and institutions. Now, Heidelberg College, going back to 1893, it opened its doors. It was the church constituency in the whole of Africa, were 200 members at the time, and they built this 4-year college thing. And 50% of the students at that time were persons of color. 50% were not Adventists. But over time, the Adventist church sort of drifted with the culture, and by the time apartheid began in 1948, this really affected our schools. So Heidelberg College really became essentially only a white school. Right. We had Good Hope College for colored students. We had Bethel College for black students. Right. And in that time, this would have been early 70s, I think. Mm-hmm. You've mentioned that you were one of 3 students who were able to come to Heidelberg. It was a special arrangement. But tell me, there were certain restrictions on what you could and couldn't do. Can you share that?
Yes. That's, I guess, part of the even more painful than the blow across the back on a baton.
Right.
Because, this is our own fellowship, our own family, our own community. And I'm thankful, though, as I look back, that I was permitted to get into Heidelberg. My father himself, who had studied 2 years at Good Hope back in the 50s, had some other challenges, and we may have a chance to talk about that. But when I was permitted, myself and my 2 friends, whom I mentioned before, to join Heidelberg, perhaps unintentionally, they did not alert us to certain parameters. Welcome, you are now full students at Heidelberg, and we were thankful for that. But all too soon we learned of some challenges that began to impact us, such as we could come to campus, but we couldn't eat in the cafeteria.
And you certainly couldn't stay in the residences.
Absolutely. No, that was completely out of bounds. Yes. Thankfully, there were some, let's put it maybe kind or brave students, guys who welcomed us to their, come to their room if we needed a place to rest during the day. And I still have wonderful memories of 2 or 3 of those gentlemen, theology majors, who invited us to come and find a place to wait, between classes.
Yes.
But no, could not stay in the dormitories, could not eat in the cafeteria.
I remember stories being told about some students who had to have a test at 7 o'clock in the morning or some early class, who actually slept over surreptitiously in the little theology faculty lounge. I don't know if that happened. Do you know of
it? Never happened to us. As I recall, for that year, we were fortunate not to have classes that early. And if we did, I don't even recall. Now remember, this is literally 50 years ago.
That's correct.
This
That's
year.
Right. Yeah.
And so, but I'm grateful for people. One of them was Alan Phillips, who every morning he was at the train station. We didn't own a vehicle, and we would come in by train, and he would be there to pick us up, take us to campus, and then in the afternoon when classes were over, he took us back. And I don't even recall him asking for a penny. He was such a gracious gentleman. I just have a wonderful memory. And despite the challenges, there were always individuals who stepped forward.
Right.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Like Alan Phillips, who just has a great memory for me, and then different students in the men's dorm who opened their room for us, even though we couldn't be in the dormitory officially. But they, come and find a place to rest during the day.
Right. Let's just go back for a moment to your father's experience. This was earlier. He was a student, in the 50s, late 50s, early 60s?
In the 50s, he went to Goodhope and studied there. He actually went to school later as an adult.
Yes.
And finished, I think, 56 or 58.
And then did he have a chance to go to Heidelberg, or what happened?
Years later, he applied, about a decade later, because Goodhope only had a 2-year program, very junior college, and then he applied, and back in 1968, they said, okay, we'll allow you in as a special student. Of course, he had a vehicle, and he was able to drive in the mornings and drive back, and we actually stayed in a town called The Strand. I have some great memories as a teenager growing up there. Dad would drive in 68 and 1969, and during those 2 years, he finished his studies at Heidelberg, basically as the first person of color allowed in since 1948, when the school had followed the government's policies of apartheid.
Right. Yeah, and then it came time for graduation, and
yes, that was an interesting interlude. When he was done, of course, graduation time, I think it was 69, as I recall, and he expected to graduate. He'd done all the work. He was, of course, an adult student, married with 2 kids, and he was informed, there are challenges with you marching down the aisle, and you cannot graduate. We'll give you your diploma, your certificate, but you can't graduate there.
Sure.
My father had been raised with an alcoholic father who kicked him out of the home at the age of 11. So he'd been raised and grew up on the street, and so he grew up as a fighter. So his natural instincts were to fight this issue, and he just was not very happy, as I remember, very unhappy. But his older brother calmed him down and said, Alwyn, justice will prevail. Be patient. Come over to the colored college. You can march with the rest there. And we'll give you your diploma that you earned at Heidelberg.
Sure. Yeah.
And my dad listened to his older brother. So he went to Goodhope and he marched down the aisle.
Now, I think if truth be told, now we won't mention names, but there was the pressure that actually came to the Heidelberg College not to do it was from some faculty who said, if you let him march down the aisle, we will boycott the whole graduation, we'll make a problem.
Correct. That's what we eventually heard the rest of the story.
And yet many, many decades later, some of those people involved in that story were welcoming to you, and so people can change. But what a horrendous experience that your father went through.
Yes.
Let me just take this opportunity, I should have done it in the beginning, to say, despite all of these hurts, I mean, the Lord has blessed you enormously in the ministry. I mean, you've along the way earned yourself 3 doctorates, one from the University of Western Cape, one from UNISA, my alma mater from South Africa, another one from Andrews, I think.
Yes.
And that is amazing. You've ministered in Africa, not just South Africa, but wasn't Kenya fairly recently?
Kenya, yes, and Zimbabwe. Spent 4 years.
That's right. At Solusi?
Yes, at Solusi, the first ever mission station.
That's
spent
correct.
4 years there as a professor.
And then in this country as well, in various things.
Correct. South America, I've served in Bangladesh.
And I think you were at Andrews when we were there. In the early 80s, was 82, 83?
Yeah, you're exactly right. 83,
wonderful.
That's right.
That's right. And your good wife and you, I mean, I think it's fair to say that you are a very solid mainstream, if not conservative Adventist. But on many points, you and your wife have really stepped out. I mean, not just on race issues, but in terms of women ordination. I think Linda is one of the most well-known online voices championing women in ministry.
That is correct. That is true. And I don't like the word conservative because I sometimes say there's the liberal left and the radical right. I want to be in what I call the centrist, scriptural centrist. You know what I mean?
Good job.
And we're all growing.
Right.
I want to be gracious because I know the older I get, the more I realize the mistakes I've made, the growing I need.
You know, I think of Eldon Thompson, who used to use the term, I'm an apostle to the Jews, others are apostle to the Gentiles, sort of thing, a way of thinking of one's ministry. But the Lord has blessed you richly, and now you are a fellow pastor here in the Southeast California Conference, and stepping into a church that has challenges. So welcome to this part of the world, to Southern California. I'm glad it's always this green, so just keep remembering how beautiful it is and how much rain we get, because that will not last forever. But I'd like you to be able to share one more experience before we finish, and that is the 3 of you who came from Good Hope College at Heidelberg, went to the principal, that's really the president, Arthur Coetzee at the time, right? And you raised certain concerns about this. And then later on, of course, you met him at Andrews again. I'd like you just to share that little dimension.
Yes, thank God, if we're open, there are always people, or at least one person who can, if we're listening, help us through some of the challenges of life.
Yeah.
And I'm thankful for Dr. Coetzee, because I'll summarize here, this is our final year of college, and so as college students, there was this special club we had to pay dues to, and for our final year activities. And one of the activities that was scheduled was an outing.
Yeah.
And so we
to the beach, wasn't it?
To the beach, correct? Yes, down a beautiful beach, but it was a whites-only beach. And so we paid our dues, and we felt unfairly treated because we, having paid the dues, then they scheduled an outing to the whites-only beach.
And you couldn't be there.
We couldn't go because legally we could have been arrested.
Yeah.
Yet the class leadership had planned it, just apparently unaware or ignoring the fact that we were part of the school now.
Wow.
So we made an appointment, and the principal or president said, "Gentlemen, thank you for coming." I paraphrase what he said, and he said, I want to suggest something to you. Don't see yourselves as guinea pigs. See yourselves as pioneers. Pioneers are willing to have to go through some of the challenges in life because you're forging a new path. And pioneers always end up suffering in some way. And that really changed my whole perspective. And I was so grateful for that. And since then, I've tried to keep that in mind. Yeah. We're always pioneers. And you mentioned, challenges. Yes, every church. Beaumont has its challenges. We're glad to be part of that. But every church, every denomination, every institution has its own challenges. And as long as I and all of us can recognize, no matter where, no matter what, we're all pioneers. Yeah. Forging ahead to be faithful to our conscience as trained by spending time in the written word to get to know the living word, Jesus.
That's right. And Ron, this whole sense, being a pioneer means that you have to be open to keep moving, because sometimes the temptation is we've pioneered and now we can sit down, but the challenges keep coming. That's right. So this sort of Adventist thing of present truth, there's always a new challenge. and to sort of keep open to that. Now, you met Arthur Coetzee again when he was at Andrews. I think he was the graduate dean.
Correct.
And worked closely with him, I think, a few years before he died. And it's powerful when we have certain people who have enough wisdom. I mean, he was sitting in a very difficult situation. Helderberg was wanting to move, but it took decades before it actually. I mean, I was there when I came back after graduate studies at the actual really massive transformation in the college's demographics and its teaching staff and things. But those were horrendous years. But even if it is not the same as being beaten across the back, those little things, not being able to share with your fellow students in the same beach, not being able to eat with your fellow students, being treated as different, as second class, is a deep, deep insult. It's hurtful, and it's wonderful that you've been able to see that in context, keep moving forward. But as we look back at a situation, it just must be that the church needs to talk about this. It needs to be to recognize that these kinds of things hurt people deeply. Right. And not to think, we've never been involved in anything that's causing discrimination or doing part of structures that are deeply hurtful to people. So I deeply appreciate your willingness to come here, chat with me for a few minutes in the light of our series here at La Sierra University Church, Black History Month. And I'm going to be reflecting a little bit about the later experience when I came back teaching at Helderberg in the 90s with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission,
right,
and the church's statement of confession. Too little, too late, always, but nevertheless something to look back on. And now, almost 25 years later, we look back and we can say, well, at least the church tried to do something, Amen. And that's important. But it's important to hear your stories, the people who were in the thick of it back early on. So I deeply appreciate you're willing to be here. Blessings as you join this conference, and we hopefully will be able to see you around and share. One other little point of connection: you have already connections with this church, because Raywin has just published a book, and you wrote for that. In fact, you worked with her closely in the development of the book, right?
Correct.
And then you have a story of running, and we're going to end with this, and that is that, my dad is the great sort of, late in life, after 60, started these marathon running, including the Comrades. Raywin started getting interested in running, and I hear that just a couple of weeks after arriving here in California, you suddenly discover the night before that there's a race in Palm Springs, a half marathon, and I think you told me that you got up, went there, and actually won your category. So there you go.
Yes, you've covered almost everything, but that was your dad was my teacher.
Yeah.
You didn't mention that. I'm ever grateful to your father, Dr. Eric Webster. He was one of 3 or 4 of my professors at Helderberg back in the 70s, for which I was ever grateful. And he was an inspiration to me as well. And I've done Comrades a couple of times, which is 2 marathons plus. And of course, when Raywin contacted me, Pastor Raywin, I was like, okay, I'm willing to help you. And of course I did. And literally just barely this past Sunday, what was the 18th of February, I woke up at 4:45 and drove out to Palm Springs and just said, let me run this for fun. Hadn't run since October when I ran a marathon in Nairobi, Kenya, when I was serving there in retirement. And the Lord blessed. I ended up winning the 70 to 74 age category. I was like, thank you, Lord. My motto, by the way, is fitness for witness. Because the healthier we are all around, not just physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, all ways, the healthier we are, the better we can share the love of Jesus.
My dad's running philosophy was always to time it down to the last couple of seconds. He would, Comrades, after running, 50 miles plus?
54.
And he would time it to the last couple of seconds. He would come in and give us all nearly a heart attack. But late in life, he began winning gold medals because he was the only person running in his age category. Ron, thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your wonderful spirit despite all that happened. And it's lovely to have a few more South Africans here in the immediate area. And of course, we have some on the staff here as well.
Right.
So thank you very much, and blessings to you.
Thank you for the invitation. This is wonderful to connect again, and glad I can share God's grace through the pain. And bottom line is, as I look back, it's helped by God's grace to develop my character, to be more and more like Jesus, hopefully, so I can encourage others, especially through the struggles of life.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you very much.